Most people believe that creating a beautiful garden takes years of experience, expensive plants, and constant effort. They imagine early mornings, endless watering, trial and error, and still disappointing results. But that's not actually the truth. Because the difference between a struggling garden and a stunning one often comes down to a single decision made at the right time. And that time is right now. If you plant the right perennials in May, something incredible starts to happen. Within just a few weeks, your garden begins to fill out. Colors start to appear. Spaces that once looked empty suddenly feel alive. And by the time July arrives, it doesn't just look better. It looks intentional, designed, almost effortless. But here's the part most people don't realize. Next year, it gets even better. And the year after that, better again. Because unlike plants that force you to start over every season, these come back. Stronger, fuller, more established. Almost like your garden is learning how to grow itself. In this video, I'm going to show you 20 beautiful perennials you can plant this May to completely transform your garden. Not just for this season, but for years to come. Some of these plants will attract pollinators nonstop. Some will thrive in conditions where nothing else survives. And a few of them might still be growing long after everything else has faded. So if you've ever wanted a garden that looks incredible without demanding more of your time every year, you're in the right place, because this is where things start to change. Now, before we get into the list, there's something important to understand. Most people approach gardening the wrong way. They treat it like a cycle, buying new plants every year, replacing what didn't survive, constantly trying to fix problems instead of preventing them. It becomes expensive, frustrating, and honestly exhausting. But perennials change that entire model. These are plants designed to return. Not just survive, but improve. You plant them once, and instead of starting over next season, you build on what you already have. They develop deeper roots. They adapt to your soil. They spread, fill space, and create a kind of natural balance that makes everything easier. And May? This is your window. The soil is warming up. Conditions are ideal for root development. Plants establish faster, stronger, and with less stress. Miss this window, and you're not just delaying results, you're delaying momentum. Now, here's where it gets interesting. As we go through this list, pay attention, because not all of these plants are equal. Some are beginner-friendly and almost impossible to mess up. Some solve problems most gardeners struggle with, like shade, poor soil, or dry conditions. And a few of them completely change how your garden feels. There's one on this list that can bloom for decades without needing to be replanted. Another one that quietly improves your soil while it grows. And the final one looks delicate, almost fragile, but once it takes hold, it becomes one of the most resilient plants you can grow. So make sure you stay all the way to the end, because the last few are where everything comes together. And if you're someone who wants a garden that actually gets easier over time, not harder, go ahead and subscribe. Because every week, I share simple ways to create a garden that works with you, not against you. Alright, let's get into it. Starting with one of the most reliable, no-fail plants you can grow. Black-eyed Susan. This is the kind of plant that almost feels unfair. Bright yellow petals, bold dark centers. It's the definition of cheerful. The kind of color that instantly lifts a space, even if the rest of your garden is still developing. But what makes it powerful isn't just how it looks. It's how little it asks for in return. Black-eyed Susans thrive in full sun. They tolerate heat, poor soil, and even periods of drought. While other plants struggle in tough conditions, this one just keeps going. And once it starts blooming, it doesn't stop quickly. You get weeks, sometimes months, of consistent color. But here's something most people don't take advantage of. If you let some of the flowers go to seed, they'll come back on their own next year. Quietly, naturally, filling in gaps you didn't even notice. Which means over time, your garden starts to look fuller, without you planting anything new. This isn't just a plant. It's momentum. And once you see how easy it is, it changes what you expect from everything else. Now, if you want something that not only looks good, but brings your garden to life in a completely different way, you need coneflower. At first glance, it's beautiful. Soft purple or pink petals, a raised center that gives it a distinctive look. But the real magic happens around it. Because coneflowers attract life. Bees, butterflies, even birds later in the season. You don't just plant it, you invite movement, energy, and activity into your garden. And surprisingly, it's just as tough as it is attractive. It handles poor soil. It tolerates drought. It doesn't need constant attention. But here's the hidden advantage. If you leave the seed heads standing after the flowers fade, birds will come back to feed on them. Long after blooming season is over, your garden is still providing something valuable. So instead of a space that peaks and disappears, you get something that continues to give. That's the shift. You're no longer just planting for appearance. You're building an environment. Now, if you prefer something cleaner, more classic, something that never feels out of place, Shasta daisies are hard to beat. There's a simplicity to them that works in almost any garden. Bright white petals, warm yellow centers, balanced, symmetrical, almost timeless. They don't try to stand out aggressively, but somehow they always do. And once they start blooming, they create this soft, calming effect that pulls everything together. They also bloom for a long time, especially if you remove spent flowers. That small bit of effort can extend their display significantly. But here's what makes them even better. Over time, they spread. Slowly, steadily, they expand their presence, filling empty areas without becoming invasive. So what starts as a small cluster eventually becomes a noticeable feature. Effortless growth, subtle impact, long-term reward. Now, let's shift into something more vibrant. Blanket flower. This is where color gets bold. Deep reds, bright oranges, sometimes with yellow edges. It almost looks like each flower is glowing from the center outward. If your garden feels flat or muted, this is one of the fastest ways to change that. But what really sets blanket flower apart is where it thrives. Dry soil, hot conditions, areas where other plants struggle. Instead of needing perfect care, it actually prefers less attention, which makes it ideal for those difficult spots that never seem to work. And once it's established, it just keeps producing blooms, one after another. It doesn't demand perfection. It rewards resilience. Now, if you want something that engages more than just your eyes, lavender changes the entire experience. Because this isn't just visual, it's sensory. Soft purple spikes, gentle movement in the wind, and a scent that instantly makes a space feel calmer. More intentional. Almost like stepping into a different environment entirely. But here's where most people go wrong. They treat lavender like a plant that needs care, when in reality, it needs restraint. Too much water? It struggles. Poor drainage? It fails. Lavender thrives when you give it space, sunlight, and just enough to survive. And in return, it gives you something very few plants can, a garden that doesn't just look good. It feels good. Now, at this point, you might be noticing something. These plants aren't just surviving. They're doing more with less. They're filling space, solving problems, creating beauty without constant effort. And that's the real advantage here. You're not just planting flowers. You're choosing a system that builds itself over time. And we're just getting started. Because now we're moving into plants that solve one of the biggest challenges in gardening. Shade. And if you've ever struggled with dark corners, areas where nothing seems to grow, or spots that always look empty, the next few will change everything. Starting with hosta. Hostas don't rely on flowers to make an impact. They rely on presence. Large, lush leaves. Deep greens, sometimes mixed with creamy whites or soft yellows. They fill space in a way that feels complete, almost like they were designed for it. And unlike most plants, they actually prefer shade. Where other plants fade or struggle, hostas thrive. They grow fuller each year, expanding outward, creating structure in places that used to feel neglected. And here's the key insight. With hostas, the foliage is the feature. You're not waiting for blooms. You're not chasing color cycles. You get consistent visual impact from the moment they're established, which makes them one of the most reliable foundation plants you can use. And once you place them correctly, they anchor that part of your garden permanently. But if you want something in the shade that feels more delicate, more expressive, Bleeding Heart is something else entirely. And this is where things start to feel a little more magical. We'll get into that next. Bleeding heart is one of those plants that feels almost unexpected. You don't just notice it, you pause when you see it. Soft, arching stems, and along them, perfectly shaped heart-like flowers that seem to hang gently in the air. Pink, sometimes white, delicate in appearance, but surprisingly dependable. It brings a completely different energy into your garden. Not bold, not loud, but emotional. Almost like a quiet detail that makes everything around it feel more intentional. And it thrives in shade. In those cooler, protected areas where sunlight is limited, bleeding heart creates something most gardens are missing: softness. But here's something important to understand. It doesn't stay forever. As the season warms up, it begins to fade and go dormant. And if you don't expect that, it can feel like something went wrong. But it didn't. This is part of its rhythm. It shows up early, creates a moment, and then makes space for something else. Which means if you plan around it, pair it with plants that emerge later, you create a layered garden that evolves over time. Not static, not predictable, alive. Now, if you have areas that stay consistently moist spots where water tends to linger, a stilbee is exactly what you need. Because instead of fighting those conditions, it thrives in them. Tall, feathery plumes rising above soft foliage, in shades of pink, white, even deep red. When it blooms, it almost looks like color floating above your garden. And it does something important visually. It adds vertical texture without feeling heavy, which helps break up flat, crowded spaces. A stilbee prefers shade or partial shade, and it loves moisture. So if you've been struggling with areas that feel too damp for most plants, this isn't a problem anymore. It's an opportunity. And once established, it comes back reliably, adding structure and softness at the same time. Now, if you want something in shaded areas that delivers color without relying on flowers, coral bells completely change the game. Because with this plant, the leaves are the show. Deep purples, bright greens, silvery tones, even rich reds that almost glow under the right light. Instead of waiting for blooms, you get constant color every single day. And that matters more than most people realize. Because flowers come and go, but foliage stays. It fills space. It anchors design. It keeps your garden looking complete even when nothing else is blooming. Coral bells thrive in partial shade, require minimal maintenance, and adapt well to different conditions. But here's the hidden advantage. When you combine different varieties together, you create contrast, layers of color that make even a small space feel designed, not accidental. And suddenly, that difficult shaded area becomes one of the most interesting parts of your garden. Now let's shift, because we're moving out of the quiet, shaded spaces and into plants that demand attention. This is where your garden starts to rise, literally. Delphinium, tall, striking, almost architectural. Spikes of blue, purple, sometimes white, reaching upward in a way that instantly draws the eye. If your garden feels flat, this is how you change that. Height creates depth. It gives your space dimension, making everything feel more dynamic. But delphinium does require a little more awareness. It prefers rich soil. It benefits from support, especially as it grows taller. And strong winds can be a challenge if it's left unprotected. But here's the payoff. When it blooms, it doesn't just add color. It creates presence. It becomes a focal point, the kind of plant people notice immediately. And once you see how it transforms a space, you start thinking differently about structure in your garden. Not just what grows, but how it grows. Now, if you want a plant that not only looks good, but actually improves your soil while it grows, lupin is one of the smartest choices you can make. At first glance, it's beautiful. Tall spikes of tightly packed flowers in purples, blues, pinks, sometimes multiple colors on a single plant. But beneath the surface, something more important is happening. Lupins are nitrogen fixers. They pull nitrogen from the air and convert it into a form your soil can use. Which means over time, they're not just growing. They're improving the conditions for everything around them. This is how your garden starts to support itself. Less input, better results. And visually, they bring a kind of wild, natural energy, like something that belongs exactly where it is. Not forced, Not artificial, just right. Now let's take that natural feeling and push it a little further. Foxglove. This is where your garden starts to feel almost untamed, in a good way. Tall stems lined with tubular, bell-shaped flowers, often in soft pinks, purples, or whites. There's something slightly unpredictable about it, and that's part of the appeal. Foxglove often behaves like a biennial. It may not fully bloom the first year, but once it does, it creates a display that feels almost woodland-like. And then it reseeds itself, quietly, which means over time, it begins to appear in new places, creating a sense of movement and evolution in your garden. Not rigid rows, not controlled patterns, but something more organic. And that's where a lot of gardens start to feel more alive. Because instead of controlling every detail, you allow some things to unfold naturally. Now, before we move into the next group of plants, pause for a moment. Because something important is happening here. At this point, you've seen plants that handle sun, shade, moisture, poor soil. Plants that attract pollinators, improve soil, fill space, and create structure. And the pattern is clear. These plants don't demand more from you. They give more. That's the shift. You're no longer building a garden that depends entirely on your effort. You're building one that starts to support itself. And from here, it gets even more efficient. Because the next set of plants focuses on function, filling gaps, supporting wildlife, extending bloom time. These are the connectors, the ones that bring everything together. Starting with bellflower. Bellflower has a softness to it. Star-shaped or bell-like blooms in shades of blue, purple, sometimes white. It doesn't overpower a space, it complements it. And that's exactly why it's useful. It spreads gently, filling in edges, softening borders, and connecting larger plants together. So instead of isolated patches, your garden starts to feel continuous, flowing. And once it establishes, it requires very little maintenance. It simply does its job, quietly, consistently. Now, if you want something that blooms longer than almost anything else, and keeps pollinators coming back again and again, salvia is one of the most reliable choices you can make. Spikes of deep purple, blue, sometimes red flowers that just keep going. And here's the key advantage. When you cut it back after the first bloom, it often comes back again, which means instead of a short display, you get extended color across the season. Bees love it. Butterflies are drawn to it. Your garden becomes active. Not just something you look at, but something that moves. And once you see that, it changes what you value. Because a garden that attracts life feels completely different from one that doesn't. Now, if you want something with a similar look, but even less maintenance, Catmint takes it a step further. Soft, lavender blue flowers that create a kind of haze across your garden. It's not about individual blooms. It's about the overall effect. And the best part? It's incredibly forgiving. Heat, drought, poor soil. It handles all of it. You can cut it back, shape it, or leave it alone, and it still performs. This is one of those plants that makes you feel like you're doing less, while getting more. And once you have a few like this in your garden, everything becomes easier. Now, let's add something a little more specialized. Penstemon. This one is built for pollinators, especially hummingbirds. Tubular flowers in bright, vivid colors that stand out instantly. And unlike many plants, it thrives in drier conditions. So if you have areas that don't get much water, this becomes an advantage, not a limitation. Penstemon adds color, movement, and function, all while requiring very little input. And again, the pattern continues. Less effort, more return. Now, to close this section, we need a plant that represents resilience at its highest level. Yarrow. Flat clusters of small flowers in whites, yellows, pinks, sometimes even reds. But what makes it powerful isn't just how it looks. It's where it grows. Dry soil, poor conditions, full sun, places where most plants struggle. Yarrow doesn't just survive there, it thrives. And once it's established, it becomes one of the most dependable plants in your entire garden. It also has a long history of medicinal use, which adds another layer of value. But beyond that, it represents something important. Strength, consistency, reliability. And by now, you're probably starting to see the bigger picture. These aren't just individual plants. They're building blocks, each one solving a problem, filling a role, contributing something unique. And when you combine them, your garden stops being something you manage and starts becoming something that works for you. But we're not done yet, because the final 3 plants change everything. Now we're at the final stage, and this is where everything comes together. Because the next 3 plants aren't just reliable, they're meaningful. They're the ones that change how you think about your garden, not just the season, but long term. These are the plants that turn gardening from a yearly task into something that feels permanent, something that grows with you. Starting with peony. This isn't just a plant, it's a commitment. At first, it might seem simple. A small plant, quiet, almost unassuming. But give it time, and it transforms. Large, full blooms in soft pinks, deep reds, pure whites, flowers that feel almost too perfect to be real. And when they open, they don't just add color. They create a moment, the kind of moment where you stop, even if just for a second, and take it in. But what makes peony truly different isn't what happens in one season. It's what happens over time. Because once it's established, it doesn't just come back. It stays. Year after year. Decade after decade. There are peonies still blooming today that were planted generations ago. Think about that for a second. This isn't just something you plant for yourself. It's something that lasts. And the best part? It asks for very little. Full sun, well-drained soil, and patience in the beginning. That's it. No constant replacing. No starting over. Just something that grows stronger, fuller, more beautiful with time. And once you see that happen, it changes your expectations completely. Now, if peony represents longevity, iris represents resilience. Because this is a plant that doesn't just return, it multiplies. Elegant, sculptural blooms in shades of purple, blue, yellow, white, each one almost architectural in design. There's a precision to it, a kind of natural symmetry that feels intentional, even though it's effortless. And it thrives in conditions that would challenge many other plants. Full sun, well-drained soil, minimal watering once established. But here's what makes iris stand out. It spreads. Slowly at first, then more noticeably. Each year, you get more blooms, more coverage, more impact, without doing anything extra. And eventually, what started as a single plant becomes a feature. Something that defines that part of your garden. And this is where the shift becomes clear. You're no longer planting for this season. You're planting for growth, expansion, continuation. Now, for the final plant. And this one surprises people. Because at first glance, it doesn't look like the strongest plant on the list. Columbine. Small, delicate flowers with intricate shapes, almost like something designed rather than grown. Soft colors, blues, purples, pinks. Sometimes with contrasting centers. It feels light, fragile even. But that perception is completely misleading. Because once columbine establishes itself, it becomes one of the most adaptable plants you can grow. It tolerates sun and partial shade. It doesn't demand perfect soil. And most importantly, it reseeds itself. Not aggressively, not invasively, but just enough to spread, quietly appearing in new spots, filling spaces you didn't plan for. And over time, your garden begins to shift. Not in a controlled, rigid way, but in a natural, evolving way. Almost like it's designing itself. And that's the moment everything changes. Because when your garden starts doing that, you stop thinking of it as something you have to manage, and start seeing it as something you guide, something you influence, but don't control completely. And that's where gardening becomes easier, more enjoyable, more sustainable. Now take a step back and look at everything we've covered. These 20 plants aren't just random choices. Each one plays a role. Some bring color. Some bring structure. Some attract life. Some improve the soil. Some fill gaps. And some last for generations. But the real power isn't in any single plant. It's in how they work together. Because when you combine them, you're no longer building a garden that depends entirely on you. You're building a system. Something that grows, adapts, and improves over time. And that's the difference most people never experience. They stay stuck in the cycle, Buying, replacing, starting over every year. Always working. Always maintaining. But never quite getting ahead. Perennials change that. They shift you from effort to momentum. From constant input to long-term return. You plant once. And instead of resetting next season, you build on what's already there. Stronger roots. More coverage. Better results. Every single year. And that's why May matters so much. Because what you plant now doesn't just affect this season. It shapes everything that comes after. So here's the question. Which of these are you planting? Are you building a garden that gets easier over time? Or are you still stuck restarting every year? Because once you make the shift, there's no going back. And if you want more ideas like this, simple ways to create a garden that looks better, feels better, and requires less over time, make sure you subscribe. Because this is just the beginning. Your garden doesn't have to be harder. It just has to be smarter. Thanks for watching. And I'll see you in the next one.